Welcome to Top Shelf Word Salad, where Ben and Jason talk about books, music, movies, and media of all sorts.
Okay, so this is Top Shelf Word Salad. That's Jason.
That's Ben.
I'm Ben. And we're talking today about this book, The Trial of Socrates.
Yes.
Am I reversed? I'm reversed. It's a book written by I.F. Stone. It was published in the late 80s, right?
Yep,
87, 88.
Yeah.
And this is a book that talks about the trial of Socrates and gets really in-depth into a lot of the details of what happened during the trial and the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I.F. Stone is a renowned journalist from the 40s through the 70s. I gather that he was rather left-wing, and he really did most of his work, his reporting, during the late 50s, the 60s, and the very early 70s. So he covered that time period, which was, the Cold War, Vietnam,
and the McCarthy
civil
era.
rights, and the McCarthy era, right?
Yeah.
So he was on the left side, but he was on the left side during this incredible time. And a lot of people think very highly of him.
Oh, I do. I definitely, the more I learn about him, the more I do. And he was blackballed by the whole McCarthy thing. That's why he started his own thing.
Yeah,
he did everything. Editor, publisher, everything.
Yep, and I remember. So when I first read this book, it was for a course in Plato. It was 25 years ago. And we were reading a few of the dialogues, and my professor, William Hansen was his name, he recommended we read this book too, and he actually spent a whole lecture talking about I.F. Stone. And my Professor Hansen, went to UCLA in the 60s, so he was very in tune with the counterculture movement and what was happening. But the one thing I remember him saying very clearly was that I.F. Stone had this way of connecting disparate things and disparate disciplines. He seemed to always be in the right spot to make these connections. And so I gather that was his weekly, his I.F. Stone weekly, that he published for 15 years or something like that.
I think it was 19.
19, yeah. So I think that was the forum where he would be discussing international politics, domestic politics, all kinds of different things would crop up in those newsletters. And so at any rate, my professor, that was one of the things he really loved about I.F. Stone in the 60s, was that he had this perspective that seemed to cut through a lot of bullshit.
Right. And he just seemed to also have he could wear many hats. He was doing investigative journalism in much the same way. I mean, just because I've spent so much time investigating Kubrick's work, but in much the same way that Kubrick started, where he was doing everything. He was doing the lighting, he was doing the editing, he was doing the sound, he was doing everything in his films. And then he eventually watched over everything. So it had this incredible detail. I think Stone's work in journalism is actually quite similar.
In what way? So in the publication of the newsletter?
Yeah.
Okay.
He started it after being blackballed, and then basically did everything himself at first and got it rolling, and it was successful. And then he oversaw everything.
So all the reporting, of course, but even laying out the sheets and making and printing and distributing and all of that stuff.
Handling distribution, handling publishing, handling editing. It's a massive job.
That's right. Every week, too.
Yeah. And then putting the time in to do the actual investigative reporting. But the reason what made me think about this is that I think his ability to draw together disparate elements comes from his... not only his working on many levels, but his consistent deep dive into investigative reporting. Yeah. And having to pull together all these things just to make the story, not only then the larger make the paper.
Yeah. So dude was good, really good at what he did for a long time.
Yeah.
The foreword in this book is really interesting because I think he's very explicit in what he wants to do. So maybe a little more background. He in 1971, I think he had some health issues that forced him into retirement, and he decided he wanted to go back and study the classics in his retirement. And so he kind of took Greek and Latin back up again. He taught himself Greek basically, which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And did a ton of reading that ultimately I think this is the one book that he produced after his retirement. So he spent 15 years on it or something like that. And in the foreword he says he fell in love with classical Athens, and he always felt like the trial and death of Socrates was this black mark on Athens. And so he's explicitly taken it upon himself to defend Athens. So that's his motivation for this, is that he loves the Athenian society so much and what it stood for, and like a lot of us do. But that was going in. What he wanted to do was address this thing that happened that seems inconceivable when you just think about what classical Greece and Athens in particular stood for. Yeah.
And just how unbelievably complicated the whole thing is, given Socrates' distaste for democracy, and the democracy being what put him to death.
Yeah. It's
just such a knot.
And it's also kind of this balance, right? Like the role of the democracy, just like you said, in putting him to death, being the thing that he kind of antagonized his whole life. I don't know. It's almost fitting, or just this. There's a characterization of Socrates as kind of being elusive and claiming he didn't know things, but also in the process of talking to people and saying that, making them look like assholes. Like that was his MO. So it's both of those things at once.
His negative dialect stuff reminded me of, I don't remember who said this, but it was a physicist talking about somebody else's work, and they said, "You're not even wrong."
You're not even wrong.
Right. So it's so bad. You're not even in the realm of thought. So
that's great. I want to know who said that.
I know, I can't remember right now, but I think that's kind of what Socrates brought to the table. He would completely break down what somebody's saying, and then say, "Well, I don't know anything." And leave it at that, but it's clearly implied, I don't know anything, but I must know more than you because I just tore your argument to pieces.
That's right. I don't know anything, but you think you know something and you don't know anything.
Right, and you're not even wrong.
So therefore, yeah.
Gee, why did people not like him?
But other people, but other people clearly loved him.
Oh, revered him.
So he was one of this he was a very divisive figure. And we'll talk about how I think that changed as time went on. But he was that yin and yang, it was a balance of opposites in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say about the reason that we decided to read this book, I've come back to a couple of times. So I had been reading through Thucydides' histories over the summer. And one thing that occurred to me that never really occurred to me before was that democracy in Athens lasted like less than 100 years. It was like beginning to end. You argue that Solon kind of set things going in the middle 6th century, but then you had 50 years of tyrant rule with Pisistratus and his sons leading up until like 508 BC. And so that 508 really marks when all the reforms of Cleisthenes came into place and gave the citizenship to property-owning men in Athens. And so that's when it starts, is 508, and then by 411 you've got all these events in between, but by 411 you've got the first overthrow of the democracy, and you get another one in 404, and then it's pretty much done. Then pretty much Alexander comes in a few decades later, and the whole thing's over, which I think is really interesting because of how we revere democracy and how how much we think of the freedoms as how important they are in our modern society. But it was like 100-year experiment.
Very
That was
brief.
it. It was over. And so right, so we were talking about that, and then just this book came to mind because it talks so much about the end of that period.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I kind of wanted. Do you remember the movie The 300? Right, it's just Sparta and roar.
Yes.
Did you?
I watched it again.
There should be a movie about
yeah.
the 30, and it should be really sedate and like just people saying, "No, you can't do that. You can no longer do that. We 30 rule now." And
that's right. Some spittle spattering across the camera.
You cannot speak freely. And that was the 404, right? 404? Yeah. Right.
404. Yeah, it was the 30. So maybe to frame the book up, the Trial of Socrates, it comes in two parts. The first half really talks about Athens' relationship with Socrates, or vice versa, like how they got along over the years, and what seeds might have been planted earlier on before this, leading up to this trial. And then the second half of the book talks about, I think he calls it the encounter, but it's really what happened in the trial and why. So that's the framework of the book. I don't. Is there anything you want to say about the structure of the book?
I mean, that's it. And it I have, on a subject this both historical and obviously philosophically oriented, just for anybody who might be interested, I've never read anything as lucid and pleasurable and easy to read, like it just has such flow. I mean, you can tell he's an investigative journalist who wrote journalism for a paper forever and just dug deep and is able to connect one thought to the next with unbelievable fluency through the entire thing.
Yeah, totally agree. I made some notes as I was reading, and one of the things I wrote that I laughed at when I saw it today was, I wrote, "This is perhaps the clearest modern writing I have ever encountered." Because it's journalistic, but it's not, but it's journalistic, so it's to the point, but it's not just short. I'm like he definitely gets into nuances in a way that you couldn't in shorter pieces. And it's an entire argument, really. The whole book is an entire argument that builds in a very rational way. So yeah, I love the writing style. Super approachable. I have differences now with Stone that I don't think I did when I first read it.
Curious to hear those,
But I would say this book opens the discussion in all the right places to think deeper about things. So if I hadn't read the book, I might not have thought as critically about these different aspects that he's bringing to light, where I've come to maybe a few different conclusions. But without it, I might not have ever read as deeply at all, or been as directed in what I was thinking about.
Well, yeah, and as we were saying before we started recording, this book has completely changed my. I mean, I didn't really have that much knowledge of Socrates. It was just all kind of my philosophy education at school started with 20th century philosophy. So it's really, really interesting. He tears them down. He really
That's
does.
good.
Yeah,
He does. Stone does. And I think I told you also I think part of my beef with Stone is that I've grown to love Socrates, the character, so much over the years. Like, he's got to be one of my very favorite historical characters. So anytime somebody's like, even, like trying to discredit him or rake him over the coals, I get this almost emotional reaction. Like, hey, lay off my Socrates, man. Overarching, I think Stone's got I think he's made the right argument and made it very compellingly. And so what I mean is, I'm going to try to lay out what I think he's saying, and any beef that I have with it is further down in the details. Okay. So, the first part of the book, he basically is saying Socrates and Athens didn't really jibe that well over the years, because Socrates was different. He was a weirdo. He didn't fit the mold. And Stone is very specific on three things. He talks about, what does he talk about? He talks about first that Socrates wasn't a big fan of the polis. Like this idea of a conglomeration of people that gathered together basically had to learn to be civilized with each other so that they could kind of create the sustainable society that he was a part of. He was not he was kind of against the grain with that. He didn't have a profession. Every day he would wake up and he would go to the agora and he would basically just try to talk to people, anybody that would have a conversation with him. This was his daily routine. He was poor, he was ugly, he basically was this pest. He'd be like, all right, let's talk about virtue. How do you define virtue? And then you get into this whole dialogue about virtue, and the person he was talking to would A, not really have much to add to the conversation, or B, just be wrong about their opinions, right? And
he would strip stuff away.
Yeah. But he was just not very political in that way, just being kind of in touch with the polis. So that's a seed that I think is going to blossom into, some of the sentiment against him later on. I think it's basically that he's just kind of a weirdo that doesn't fit, when the polis is all about, we've all got to get along together, we've all got to get through this as a society.
Right. And he's walking around in the dirty tunic, stinking a bit and tearing down everybody's argument. But still doing it brilliantly and being respected for his courage and his military experience. People obviously had a lot of respect for him.
Yeah, and maybe I don't save it all. So I don't think Socrates was anti-polis. I think in a lot of ways Socrates was Athens. He was born in maybe 470, I think, or 471. Right, that was right after Marathon had happened, and that was right after the Persian Wars with Xerxes. So he basically is beginning his life at the same time that the Athenian empire and democracy is truly starting to grow. And then in 432, Socrates is going to be maybe 40 years old, and that's when the Peloponnesian War starts. So basically, for all of Socrates' growing adult life, the Athenian empire is growing throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And then when he hits basically middle age, that's when this conflict with Sparta starts and lasts pretty much all the way until his trial. So in a way, his life mirrors this life that I was talking about before of the democracy, this 100-year democracy. He's kind of right in the sweet spot. And he was a free thinker. Obviously, he spoke his mind. He was revered by a lot of people. He was reviled by others. But he did fight in the Peloponnesian War. When it was his time to fight, he went and did battle. He says the only time he ever left the city of Athens was to go to battle. Wow. And he did serve. So another thing we'll talk about is that he preached a withdrawal from public life, at least for himself. But he did, on a couple of occasions, have to participate, and he did. So it's almost. So my thing is, I don't know that he was anti-polis as much as he was just following his own thing. But at the end of the day, he was obeying the laws of the city. He was doing what was right, what he was called on to do. I think that Stone goes so far as to say he was basically preaching anti-democracy and getting younger people in this almost movement to overthrow it.
Right. That's his argument for why he was eventually convicted.
Yeah. So that's one of the things. I think the second thing that Stone says is, for Socrates, he would equate virtue with knowledge. So there's this idea, Socrates asking everybody in the agora, what is virtue? And nobody knows. What are you talking about? And basically he winds up saying, well, it's a kind of knowledge, but he almost refuses to suggest that it's teachable knowledge. So it's not knowledge in the way that we think about learning things. For him, it's this philosophical deal where you might, God might have given you this knowledge, and if you're part of the, the richest or the people that know the most, then this knowledge has been bestowed upon you. But you can't teach it. It's not like you can take anybody in the masses and pick them out and say, okay, I'm going to teach you knowledge, and then you'll be virtuous, because doing that would really open up the whole, right, the whole political system to democracy.
And nobody can define virtue anyway.
Right. And so,
sorry,
and so this one,
go ahead.
I can't argue with this. The way that I read this entire thing is, he was just a pain in the ass. This was him going, hey, what's virtue? It's like, you tell me, Socrates. No, I don't know. I know that I don't know what virtue is. I'm talking to you because please teach me what it is. And, his whole thing was just frustrating people, and it just kind of irritating them.
And Stone talks about that when he mentions Aristotle, saying that one of Socrates' greatest contributions is that he was the first to kind of wrestle with definition.
Yes, yeah, which was a big thing that Aristotle really did, and before that, nothing was defined. Yeah, so that would be a huge contribution of Socrates to Aristotle, to the beginnings of organized philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Even like the early Christian philosophy of like Aquinas, and I mean, so many of the early Christian, I guess you call them philosophers, teachers, whatever, seem to depend heavily on Aristotle. So,
yeah, for sure. So one is he was kind of anti-polis. Two is he had this equation of virtue with knowledge, but it was unteachable knowledge somehow. And the third thing is that Socrates talked about not wanting to participate in political life, so trying to stay as far away from it as possible. He talked about that in the Apology too. I mean, he was very specific about that. Again, I can't disagree with it. What I said before, I think applies in my mind, that whenever he was called to serve, he did. Like whenever he had to, not that he wanted to be a part of, Athenian political life, but if he needed to, he would.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which, is kind of a little bit outside of. I mean, Stone just makes it like he only ever participated twice in anything. And well, I guess 3 times in the military campaign, and then he was kind of involved in the first anti-democratic uprising, but not really. He didn't do much. And then the second one, because, that later plays into the trial. 2 of his followers were very pivotal, and they were members of the 30.
Yes, Critias and Charmides were like.
I'm glad you said it
they
first.
Were like, and the 30, and he had another student. This is fun to pronounce too. Alcibiades.
Yeah.
But in the Greek, it's actually more like Alcibiades. So you could do it either way.
I so prefer Alcibiades.
Alcibiades.
That's just fun to say.
So Alcibiades was central to the revolution in 411, which was really more of a puppet assembly was installed. It wasn't like just a very small group. It was a small group installed something that looked a little democratic but wasn't really. So that was Alcibiades, who, by the way, is one of the most fascinating people in history.
Yeah.
Look it up.
Oh, yeah. That would Plutarch write about him.
Yeah. Just fascinating. But Alcibiades was a student and part of the earlier initial overthrow, and then Critias and Charmides for the 30, which was far more harsh. And they were all 3 were very prominent students of Socrates, or I don't know that you can say students, acquaintances of,
Right.
because Socrates makes a big point that he was never a teacher. He never accepted money for lessons. He just talked to people, and he even admits freely that younger people love to hear him kind of tear other people down, so they would watch him do it, and then they'd go off on their own and kind of do it to other people, which I'm sure led all the way back to more people being pissed off
Exactly,
at Socrates.
yeah.
Because he's not formally teaching them how to do it, but this is what he does every day, and they watch him and they learn his techniques.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay, this is a total weird interjection moment, okay, but brief, I promise, is that one thing I thought numerous times in reading through this stuff is that when I read the 20th century philosophy stuff in college, I was subjected to a little bit of Derrida, and
Subjected to.
I couldn't stand it. I really didn't like his. He just seemed to like revel in being impenetrable, but some of what Derrida, his main thing that he was to some extent famous for is deconstruction. But deconstruction to me, once I read this and thought about it a little bit, seems very much like Socrates' negative dialect. It's just tearing down what's there and trying to see what's left. But with Derrida, it's tearing down what's there for the sake of a radical relativism.
Yeah.
So he just takes it a little bit further. But with Socrates, it's just trying to get to the idea of truth by stripping everything away. But I think Stone is right. I mean, maybe you know this much better than I do, but I think Stone is right in the sense that Socrates didn't put forth a positive dialect. He didn't put forth something saying, okay, now that all of that is gone, perhaps this is the thing. He just left the stripped away, rotting carcass to rot.
Yeah.
So
That's an interesting comparison, and so tell me what you think of this. With Socrates, I have a little bit of a reaction to the phrase negative dialectic.
Okay.
So I think of it as dialectic, meaning dialogue, meaning it's a conversation that takes place for the two parties to try to understand something and to come to some common terms and to think about something. And yes, the end result is you want some positive outcome where you agree on something. And yes, that almost never happens in the dialogues of Socrates. But the word negative there, I mean, it obviously has a negative connotation. And I think what it means is the negative is there's no assertion that Socrates is making. That's why it's a negative. But Socrates would say that he's really just searching for the wisdom that he doesn't have.
right.
And so I think Stone would say that's a bullshit front. He's actually trying to advance a political agenda. He's actually trying to teach these kids to overthrow the democracy. He's actually just doing this as a front to make people look stupid. But I think there's another way to look at it where you just take Socrates on face value on what he says. That maybe he is just a curious person. Maybe he is a social person that wants to talk about this stuff and doesn't feel like he has an idea what these concepts are. And if you think of it like that, there's not a negative connotation to the dialectic.
It's a search.
You know what I mean?
It's a seeking process.
Yeah. So, and I like to think of Socrates like that. I think Stone likes to think of Socrates as a little bit more causing trouble, stirring things up.
Yeah.
Engendering the enmity that the state eventually kind of puts against him. And so when you talk about Derrida, I don't know much about Derrida, but I from what I understand, the deconstruction the intention is to destroy something. It is to overthrow some concept that's there, which is a little bit more devious and negative.
It is. And it almost to overthrow the concept of concept, because everything, you can interpret any given text hypothetically infinitely. So anything that's happening in the text, no matter what it is, it could be fiction, it could be anything. Anybody who's reading it is bringing their radical relativism by being an individual to the interpretation of the text. So you can make almost anything out of anything. So much of that stuff reminds me of ideas of the heat death of the universe. Everything gets totally separated. Everything's equidistant. There's no heat. There's no motion. Everything's
no movement.
Everything's
stops.
Radically relative, but also totally equal. And so you get to a point where there's a lot of stuff that's far apart that means nothing.
Right. It takes the meaning out of everything.
Right. Just like the kind of opening yourself up to the vacuum of space kind of, vibe. Yeah. That's like the Derrida jam.
It's horrible. I hate that idea.
I hate it too.
I don't. I mean, I guess I'm glad I haven't studied it too much.
I mean, this is what little I studied a very long time ago. So if I feel like I'm accurate with this, but I don't feel like I'm high definition accurate. So
yeah, okay, fair enough. Okay, so that's kind of the first half of the book is the history of Socrates in Athens and how he might have built up some ill will against himself over the years. And then the second half is the trial itself, which is kind of fascinating.
It is. It
right?
really is.
He draws out a lot of the weird, unique situations around this trial and how it went down. And even in Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Apology, you also get this like remarkable, radical response by Socrates to what's happening to him that you almost can't believe it. So you can see, I don't know, stop me if I'm jumping all over, but on the one hand, Athens can somehow point to some statute to bring Socrates to trial. And there's a trial that happens, and then after the trial's over, if Socrates is guilty, there's a second hearing, which is the sentencing. Right? So that's how the structure of this works. And if he's not guilty, there's no sentencing. And so my interpretation as to what really happened is that Athens kind of had it with Socrates and brought him up on some charges, thinking he might be acquitted. The people might acquit him. Or if they didn't, there would be some slap on the wrist kind of punishment. I don't think when this motion was started by these guys that they really thought there was going to be a death involved.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, what I'm talking about with the radical reaction of Socrates is the guy was 71 years old, and he basically said, "I'm at the end of my life anyway." And he said, I haven't done anything wrong. Bring the charges on. I'll defend myself. And his defense was not anything that was geared toward getting people to like him more. But it stuck to all of his principles.
Well, and
he was convicted.
Right. And he jumped over opportunities. Like he could have used like Stone talks about this, the free speech defense, which he just avoids.
He does.
It's just amazing.
So his. And that's what I mean. I think when these charges were brought up, people thought, well, he's a good speaker. He'll get up there and he'll talk about something and he'll convince 300 people to let him go. And we will have made our point. And it's almost like he wanted to be convicted, and then he wanted to make sure that his punishment was death instead of something lesser. And I think in Xenophon's Apology, Xenophon literally says that Socrates wanted to die.
He does.
So I think that's why you get this. That's why you get this story, which is in Stone's eyes this black mark on Athens, and just in history's eyes this really weird kind of, somebody dying for the things that a philosopher dying for the things that he thinks and says.
And yet nothing that he did.
Nothing that he did. And it coincides with the end of Athens and Spartan dominance and eventually Macedonian dominance.
And it was with
Alcibiades. Alcibiades.
He actually, part of his exile was him going to Sparta and living as a Spartan and adopting that completely, like growing his hair and being kind of rougher and not giving a crap about poetry or whatever,
Yeah, this is why I love the guy. I want to know more about this guy. So he's in Athens. He's young. He's beautiful. He's a political hotshot in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. He gets involved with the expedition to Syracuse, which is basically the demise of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. It's just a terrible tactical mistake. He gets involved with it right when they're about to invade Syracuse. He gets called back to Athens because there's some trumped up charges against him. Basically, he'll be up. It's complicated, but there's a reason. So they send a boat, they call him back, and he runs. And he goes to Sparta. And that's what you're talking. So he's in Sparta now, and he's helping the Spartans in this conflict that he was just helping the Athenians in. And then over a few years, he builds up so much enmity with the Spartans that they want to have him put to death. So he jumps over to Persia.
That's amazing.
He becomes an advisor for Persia, right, who's trying to play Sparta and Athens against each other after being humiliated with their previous defeat. And then he goes from Persia and he comes back to Athens. So there's something about this guy that he's able to sell himself. Yeah. Right. But there's also something hateable about this guy where after he just burns his whatever it is, it's just gone after a couple of years and he's got to move on. It's amazing. Yeah, and he winds up all the way back in Athens, right? And he's ultimately killed by the group that's fomenting I think the third because he's afraid that Alcibiades is so much friendlier to the people that he can flip, and he won't be about the oligarchy anymore. He'll say, no, I'm about the democracy. And he's got that much charisma or pull or whatever it is. Like it's just
one of the earliest examples.
It's amazing.
Of the, virtuosic opportunist. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yes, and
there's
somehow
something kind of Trumpy.
Yes, and so I admire that. Meaning, I just would like to sit down and talk to that guy for an hour and just find out how the hell he did it. Not that I admire the political moves he made, but that's I think that's an important backdrop to what happened in 411. That probably people were like, oh, Alcibiades, he was next to Socrates every day. He was always in the agora with him.
Yeah.
Look what
These
happened
are the people
to him.
Socrates has been grooming. And Socrates, being fairly vocal about an undemocratic slant. But when you get to the actual trial, he just foregoes all these opportunities to have a fairly knockdown argument as to why he definitely shouldn't be put to death, but possibly should not, be. I'm not sure what that found guilty to begin with in the first part of the thing, because it comes in two parts, like you said.
Yeah.
The trial. So yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really head scratching. It's kind of like he approached it as, okay, you want to play this game, I'm going to play it to the end, and you, and let's see what happens.
I couldn't say it better, and. That's why I love the guy.
Right. Yes.
I mean, how great is that?
I'm 71. And I'm on my way out anyway. You're just going to speed this along. It's hemlock's not a bad way to die. I'll make all of you look horrible. I'll make this democracy thing look shit that I don't like to begin with. This seems like a win-win-win for me.
Right.
Aside from the whole death thing.
Yeah. Aside from that, and it's. And it's funny too. So in the Apology, in Plato's Apology, I think he starts off saying, so we don't hear what the prosecution said. So the Apology really means defense, and so it picks up where Socrates begins his defense. So the prosecution has already spoken, and he starts off by saying, I can't even recognize myself based on what these guys just said about me. It's like they said so many things that were untrue. And then he says, but the craziest thing they said is, beware that I'm a great orator and I'm going to be really slick and fool you into dropping these charges, right? But if you look at the Greek, it's super slick rhetoric. It's like he's saying this. He's saying, like, the second I open my mouth, they're going to be proven wrong and they should feel stupid. But he's opening his mouth, and actually, like, Plato writes beautiful Greek, but he's taking pains to make this sound like a sophist or a rhetorician, like in the way that he's constructing all of his phrases and building up what he's going to say.
Oh God!
So it's something you would never get out of like the original, but it's even right there in the beginning. That's the fuck you thing. That's
right.
This is my way of talking when I talk to regular people, but he's not saying it like that. Like he's actually saying it in the way that they
in a phrasing that you're right.
Yeah.
It triggers like sophist alert.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. God, I didn't pick that up. That's amazing.
Yeah. So there's so much to this stuff. So, what was the other thing I wanted? So in the second part of the book, I think the main thing Stone argues, and I think that he's 100% correct about, is what he calls the three earthquakes.
Right.
So when he says the three earthquakes, he's talking about political events in Athens.
Right.
The first one comes in 411, right? The second in 404, which are those two overthrows of democracy that we've talked about. And then the third is this, what looks to have been like a plan for a third overthrow in the works in 400, months before this trial took place. That's right. And each one of the previous two little earthquakes lasted maybe like 6 to 8 months. So that's good context too, as it was democracy, and then it was this radical thing that happened that was kind of flipped relatively quickly, but it was an ongoing tense situation, really. From
and sounded violent. I mean, there was like a Spartan garrison for one that had been hired.
Yeah.
Off of the value of the estates of the accused.
Yeah.
Which is really devious, terrible stuff.
Yeah. They had these gangs of guys with clubs that would walk around and intimidate people.
Yeah.
And Thucydides talks about it. So Thucydides' history goes up to 411, I think. And so he gets a little bit of that first overthrow, which isn't even the big one. But he has this beautiful way of relating what was happening, is that the people that were overthrowing the democracy were basically making it such a negative stigma to talk about or support the democracy that nobody said anything. And because people stopped talking about it, people started to distrust, everybody started to distrust everybody. Because nobody was talking about their point of view, then you couldn't know if it was okay to say a certain thing in a certain context. And Thucydides says this is the thing that made the overthrow work. Like, they did that on purpose. They basically took the voice away from the demos, from the people in the democracy.
Which reminds me of the Gulag Archipelago, and reminds me of the weird social justice, like you can't talk about certain things now, and you can't say things in certain ways.
Yeah.
And it's just on and on and on. It's just the same stuff happening again and again and again.
Right.
Again. I mean, it's gives one pause.
And we, like, if you think today, we have certain guarantees of free speech. You didn't really have them explicitly back then. Mm-hmm. I think Stone argues that you have to think of Athens as this very open, accepting society, extremely tolerant of points of view. Essentially, I think they had the underpinning of free speech, but they didn't have a First Amendment. You know what I mean? Like this thing that you could point to and say, this is our right to say whatever we think.
Yeah. It is, and I think the fact that again, like you were saying, Socrates is using the language at the time to obviously imply a certain level of sarcasm by portraying himself as being one of these, sophist teachers who speak in a certain way. The fact that he didn't bring up a free speech defense becomes almost itself sarcasm, like a sarcastic non-statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's it. I do. And the other, there is this thing with the sophists too. So sophists were teachers who charged money to teach people how to speak in the assembly. And Socrates was kind of lumped in with them. The regular layperson would be like, he's a sophist too, right? But then he makes this huge point to say, I don't accept money. They do. I don't. But then he comes out talking just the way that they talk. So you can imagine if you're in the assembly and you're just a guy, you're doing your voting duty. What is going on? Like, of course you're a teacher. Of course you're like...
And Socrates is doing everything he can to get himself killed. I mean, that's kind of astonishing. And there's just so many different ways to look at it. But again, it just seems like he wants to put a kind of negative spotlight on the Athenian concept of democracy by being killed by the democracy. And
yes,
he brings it about.
And he does it, so not just that, but he does it while maintaining perfect consistency with what he's always said and done.
Yeah. Wow. Right? God, yeah. So there's like a counterpoint element. It's like some like really, really dark Bach invention that has two different lines happening.
Like not only do I accomplish this, the stain on Athens forever, I also am like not retreating in any way from what I've
always done. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm who I am. I am faking it. You're going to kill me. It's going to make you look bad. Forever.
That's right.
I win. Right?
Or do I?
Right. Yeah. It's a strange type of victory.
Yeah. What else about the second part? So I think the three earthquakes, like we said at the beginning, democracy was pretty short-lived. The Peloponnesian War starts in 430 and really throws Athenian society into a tailspin for 30 years. It gets worse and worse. The democracy gets more and more tenuous. This stuff plays out in the way that we've talked about, and Socrates goes to trial, kind of punts on his defense, or, however you want to say it. He frames it in a way that is certain to get him convicted. And then, essentially, when it comes to naming the penalty, this is the thing that happened in the penalty portion of the trial. The defendant who was convicted got to suggest the penalty first, and then people would vote on it. And this is where Xenophon's apology is different than Plato's, but Plato says that Socrates said, well, you convicted me. What penalty is right for me? I think I should be housed and fed at public expense. Just like the Olympic athletes. I think that's the only fair punishment for me, right?
Which again ups the sarcasm factor. Like my punishment should be and he would be housed and fed for life, for the rest of his life.
For life. Right. Yeah. He said you do this for the Olympic victors, and all they do is they run a race. I actually provide a service to the city. I go down and I talk to people every day.
I have thought a race for 50 years. And I win every day.
Yeah. So that's again carrying the smartass thing. But then after that, in Plato's apology and in Xenophon, he does suggest a fine, but it's a
one
small amount of
or
money.
Whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah, which is I don't even remember now what the ratios are, but it's like, maybe half a year's salary or something like that for an average person. And then that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and then he's put to death. He drinks hemlock, kind of walks in a circle for a bit, lays down, and dies.
Yeah.
And
it's
Stone
over.
does talk about how he feels that Socrates was cold to his wife in their last moments. I have absolutely no Xanthippe, or I don't remember how to say it.
Yeah,
Xanthippe.
Yeah.
And how he had 3 kids. 1 was older and 2 were younger, and which I don't know. So it's Stone does go out of his way to paint a pretty negative portrait. So there are elements of this stuff where obviously all of this is taken from other people's observations, and often years after the fact. And then he's, what they choose to include in their recollection, he's basing a judgment, especially in this sense, and how Socrates treated his wife at the end, on how they are describing this moment. So I don't feel comfortable even believing that stuff so much.
Right.
Just because, I mean, why would Plato go to like great lengths when he's like so obviously in love with Socrates to talk about how Xanthippe is feeling? He probably wouldn't do that,
right.
Just not out of disrespect to her, just out of focus on Socrates, because that's, oh my gosh, he's dying. This is the end. What are we gonna do? This guy's the pillar of thought in Athens, and Athens just put him to death. So.
Yeah, I think that you're hitting on something I think really important. I think Stone spends a lot of time on this, like, how Socrates is just not a really. It doesn't look like he's in a good light at the end of his life, knowing he's going to die, and just kind of sending her and the kids away. But there is this tradition that Socrates didn't really give a shit about his family. He literally had no job and got up every day and left the house. He didn't provide for them. He lived off of a very meager inheritance. Right, yeah. And this was part of his aura, even before he was put to death, was that he wasn't really a family man. He got a wife and he had some kids. Also, he would have been really old, not unusual in Greece, but I think the apology, and I think Xenophon's apology says that he had 1 child who had just become an adult and 2 that were younger. So if he's 71, he must have had the first kid 20 years before or something. So it's very late in life.
And she's carrying one of the kids at one point. She's described as, so it's got to be like a little kid. So he
yeah. And it been probably a young mother, young wife.
Stuff. It froze. Oh God, technical difficulties.
Jazz hands.
The theme running through all of the top shelf word salad.
Here we go. I'm gonna be.
Right.
This is I'm Jason C doing When Bud Walks.
The technical difficulties.
In walked Bud.
I think it keeps freezing and not. So
are you
I guess
recovered
this is
yet?
a good spot to end.